Let me ask you something. When a country signs a deal by itself, opens its ports by itself, and follows the rules willingly, is that cooperation? Or is that control working perfectly? Because China didn't collapse in a war. There was no single defeat. No final surrender. Yet somehow China ended up kneeling, and this is where the real story begins. Not with cannons, not with armies, but with a hand. A quiet one, a patient one. A hand that didn't force China forward, but showed it the path. Every step felt reasonable. Every agreement felt temporary. Every decision felt like the smart choice at the time. That's how the trap works. You don't feel pushed. You feel guided. That same hand opened doors. That same hand closed exits. And by the time the pressure became visible, there was nowhere left to turn. Most people never notice this part of history. They jump straight to the outcome. We're not doing that here. We're going to follow that hand. From the first move to the final moment where you decide for yourself, what actually forced China to kneel, and whether it ever realized who was pulling the strings. Stay with me, because once you see this pattern, you'll start recognizing it far beyond China. To understand how this started, you have to drop the idea that Britain arrived as an enemy. It didn't. When United Kingdom looked at China, it didn't see a battlefield. It saw a system, closed. And it had no reason to open its economy to outsiders. From China's perspective, this wasn't arrogance. Britain didn't present itself as a rival. It presented itself as a solution. This is the moment most people miss, because nothing looks dangerous yet. This is where the hand first touches the board. After that, nothing moves by force. Britain had ships, global routes, access to markets China didn't control. And behind that offer was a problem Britain couldn't ignore. Silver. Britain needed it. China had it. So the first move wasn't pressure, it was alignment. Trade didn't arrive as a demand. It arrived as an opportunity. Not because China was being fooled, but because the offer was designed to feel safe. To China, this didn't feel like surrender. It felt like balance. Limited access, controlled ports, rules China still believed it could enforce. And this is the part most people miss. Once China said yes the first time, saying no the second time became much harder. Not because of force, because of precedent. Refusing Britain outright meant isolation. Accepting trade meant stability. At least that's how it looked. Nothing about this moment felt dangerous. No alarms. No sudden loss of power, just a small adjustment, a controlled opening, a decision that felt reversible. But here's what that choice quietly did. Every agreement didn't just add something new, it reduced something China already had. Flexibility, leverage, the ability to walk away. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough to matter later. And once that shift happened, future decisions stopped feeling optional. After the first agreement, nothing appeared to be wrong. China was still strong, its authority still functioned. Ports were regulated, permissions existed, and foreign trade remained limited. From the outside, the system looked exactly as it always had. When British ships returned, they didn't arrive as outsiders testing the rules. They arrived as participants in an arrangement that already existed. Access wasn't demanded, but it was assumed. Delays were no longer accepted as routine. They now required explanation. Nothing illegal was happening, nothing dramatic, just friction. Saying no was still possible. No law prevented it, no authority had been lost. So decisions didn't change in principle, they changed in comfort. Officials began choosing the option that produced fewer complications, fewer questions, fewer immediate problems. Not because they were weak, but because the system now rewarded cooperation with ease and resistance with inconvenience. And this is where the real shift took place. China treated inconvenience as harmless, temporary, manageable. History treats it differently. Because once decisions start being made to avoid friction rather than to protect control, the space to choose freely begins to narrow. Even while everything still looked stable, nothing had collapsed, nothing had broken. But the conditions were now in place for something far more effective than pressure to enter the system. By this stage, trade itself was no longer the problem. United Kingdom had achieved access. Merchants moved freely enough. Ports functioned. Resistance felt inconvenient. But one problem refused to disappear. Britain was still bleeding silver. Every shipment of tea, silk, and porcelain pulled precious metal out of Britain with nothing flowing back the other way. China didn't want British manufactured goods. No negotiation could fix that imbalance. It was structural. And by the early 1800s, it was becoming dangerous. So Britain stopped trying to change Chinese demand. Instead, it redirected it. In eastern India, in a region Britain controlled tightly, Bengal, there was a crop cultivated under strict supervision. It wasn't grown for food. It wasn't part of any official trade agreement. It was refined carefully, compressed into transportable form, and already circulating through illegal channels across Asia. Britain didn't invent the demand. It noticed it. And then it organized it. Merchant ships leaving India began arriving in China carrying something different, not advertised, not declared openly. But it moved through the same routes trade already used. Silver began flowing back, not through treaties or diplomacy, but through habit. This solved Britain's problem with brutal efficiency. But inside China, something felt off. By the 1820s, reports were reaching higher officials. Not about tariffs or port violations, but about behavior, about productivity dropping, about silver moving in the wrong direction. And what looked like a social issue began to feel like a strategic one. Inside the Qing administration, debates started quietly. Was this still trade, or was this something else? China did attempt restrictions, local bans, seizures, crackdowns. But enforcement ran into a familiar wall. Merchants resisted. Revenue dipped. Ports complained. Every strict measure created friction that administrators were now trained to avoid. Stopping the flow caused immediate disruption. Allowing it caused delayed damage. Human systems almost always choose the option that hurts later. So tolerance crept back in, not because officials approved, but because resistance felt heavier. If you're still watching, this is the moment to slow down. Because nothing here looks dramatic. No invasion. No declaration. Just a system quietly choosing the least painful option again and again until that option reshapes the system itself. And when China finally tried to assert authority decisively, Britain didn't argue about morality. It reframed the conflict entirely, not as a drug issue, but as a legal one. When China finally tried to shut the system down, it didn't act impulsively. It acted as a state. Enforcement increased, warehouses were raided, flows were interrupted. From China's perspective, this wasn't escalation, it was restoration, an attempt to take back control over a system that had quietly slipped. Britain responded by changing the rules of the confrontation. The issue was no longer about what was being traded. It was reframed as a question of rights. Enforcement became interference. Regulation became aggression. China's attempt to assert authority was presented as a violation of international commerce. This is where the invisible hand stopped guiding and started closing its grip. Once framed this way, the outcome stopped depending on facts. It depended on leverage. In 1842, after the conflict was settled militarily, China was compelled to sign what became known as the Treaty of Nanking. It was described as a peace agreement. In reality, it rewrote the operating rules. Ports were opened permanently. Tariff control was weakened. Foreign merchants were placed beyond Chinese law. Territory was ceded as a guarantee. But the most important part wasn't any single clause. It was the logic the treaty created. From this point onward, violating the agreement didn't reset negotiations. It triggered punishment. If China restricted trade, retaliation followed. If it enforced laws on foreigners, force was justified. If it resisted, the outcome wasn't revision. It was another treaty, harsher than the last. This made the system one-directional. Compliance didn't restore authority. It only prevented escalation. Resistance didn't protect sovereignty. It accelerated loss. So every decision China made after this followed the same calculation. Enforce the rules and risk immediate punishment, or tolerate violations and preserve what remained. The agreement didn't end conflict, it automated it. Power no longer needed to be asserted each time. The rules themselves carried consequences. Authority still existed, but it could no longer be exercised freely. Law still functioned, but not evenly. Each attempt to push back produced a worse outcome than the one before. Each concession avoided short-term damage, but locked in long-term decline. By the time this pattern became clear, the choice was no longer between winning and losing. It was between rapid collapse and managed survival. And that choice explains everything that followed. By this point, the question was no longer whether China had the authority to act. It was whether acting would make things worse. After the treaties locked the rules in place, every decision began with the same calculation. Not, is this right? But what happens next if we do this? The answer was always predictable, and that predictability is what narrowed China's options. For China, enforcement had become a trigger. Restrictions invited retaliation. Regulation justified punishment. Resistance didn't lead to renegotiation. It led to escalation under terms China could no longer influence. So the choice stopped being symbolic. If China complied, it lost control slowly. If it resisted, it lost more, faster. That logic mattered more than ideology. What appeared to outsiders as a narrow trade issue had turned into a mechanism that governed survival itself. Any serious attempt to reverse it risked reopening conflict, forcing more ports open, extracting more revenue, and tightening legal constraints even further. Knowing this, China adjusted, not because it accepted the system, because it understood the cost of breaking it. Rules were applied selectively, exceptions multiplied. Tolerance became policy, not announced, but practiced. This wasn't surrender, it was containment. The state chose continuity over confrontation. It preserved what authority it could internally, even as external controls slipped further away. Every decision was weighed against a single question. Will this provoke something worse? And once a system begins governing itself around that question, it no longer needs to be overpowered. It regulates its own limits. By this stage, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Only the interpretation remained. If you trace the story backward, one thing becomes clear. No army marched in and took control. No flag was lowered in surrender. No single moment announced the transfer of power. Instead, something else was at work. A hand that never raised its voice. A hand that never needed to strike first. A hand that adjusted incentives, narrowed choices, and waited. Every step China took felt voluntary. Every compromise felt reasonable. Every retreat felt temporary. But the direction never changed. Access led to dependence. Dependence led to rules. Rules turned resistance into punishment. That was the design. This is the kind of power that doesn't need to conquer. It only needs to shape the environment until every decision points the same way. By the time China chose survival over confrontation, the choice had already been prepared, not by force, but by structure, not by chaos, but by calculation. This is what the invisible hand actually does. It doesn't push nations to their knees, it rearranges the ground beneath them until standing becomes impossible. And when the moment finally arrives, no one remembers being forced. They only remember choosing. So the question isn't whether China lost. The question is whether this was the most efficient way power has ever changed hands. Because once you learn to see the hand, you start noticing it everywhere.